You made the decision everyone around you was quietly hoping you would eventually make, the decision that felt impossible for so long, because it required admitting that someone you loved was never going to meet you the way you needed to be met. You walked away from someone who mastered the art of almost present, almost honest, almost committed, and you did it not out of anger, but out of a clear-eyed recognition that almost was never going to become enough, no matter how much patience you extended or how much time you gave them to arrive. What you did not expect, and what almost no one warns you about, is what happens next on their side of the silence. You expected relief for yourself, and you got it eventually, once the initial grief settled. What you did not expect was the panic that would begin building on the other end, quietly at first, then unmistakably, once the avoidant realized that this time, the door did not simply close halfway the way it always had before. It closed completely, and it closed because you closed it, and there was nothing left for them to manage, negotiate, or wait out. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told because it happens far away from you, in rooms you no longer have access to, in the private hours when the avoidant is alone with a decision they did not make and cannot undo. You made the right decision. That much is not in question. What is unfolding now is the direct, traceable consequence of that decision landing on the one person who spent years assuming it would never actually happen. The assumption that just collapsed. For the entire relationship, the avoidant operated on a quiet, unspoken assumption that you would stay. Not because you had promised to stay through anything, and not because they had earned that certainty, but because you always had before. Every time they pulled away, you waited. Every time they went quiet, you found a reason to be patient. Every time they gave you almost instead of everything, you told yourself that almost was a phase, that time would soften it into something more. That pattern taught the avoidant something dangerous, that your patience was a constant, not a limit. It taught them that they could set the terms of closeness indefinitely, retreating whenever things felt too real and returning whenever they missed the comfort of having you nearby, without ever having to reckon with the possibility that one day, the invitation to return simply would not be there anymore. Your decision shattered that assumption completely. There was no dramatic final fight required, no elaborate speech necessary to make the point. The point made itself simply by the fact that you did not wait this time. And once that assumption collapsed, the avoidant lost something they never realized they were leaning on until it was gone, the certainty that no matter how far they drifted, you would always be there when they were ready to drift back. This is the first domino. Everything else, the panic, the sleeplessness, the sudden flood of messages, or the sudden desperate silence, depending on the person, starts here, with an assumption they built their entire approach to you around, finally proven false in the one moment they least expected it to be tested. Why this panic is different from anything before. The avoidant has experienced discomfort before. They have experienced arguments, brief periods of distance, moments where you expressed frustration and they retreated further into themselves to manage it. None of that discomfort resembles what is happening now, because none of it carried the same finality. Previous discomfort always came with an exit, a way back, a version of events where enough time and enough space would eventually restore things to where they had been. This time, there is no exit available because you are the one who built the door, and you are the one who walked through it and did not look back. The avoidant cannot manage this the way they managed everything else, through withdrawal, through waiting it out, through letting silence do the work that honesty never had to. Silence was always their tool. Now silence belongs to you, and being on the receiving end of it, rather than the one wielding it, is an experience they have almost no practice tolerating. This is why the panic feels so unfamiliar to them, so much larger than anything a simple breakup should produce. It is not simply the loss of a relationship. It is the loss of a strategy that worked for their entire life, failing for the first time against a person who finally stopped absorbing the cost of it. The avoidant is not panicking because they miss you in some simple, sentimental sense. They are panicking because the entire operating system they built to survive intimacy has just been proven obsolete, and they do not yet have anything to replace it with. The messages that reveal everything. If you have received messages since making your decision, look closely at what they actually contain, because the content reveals far more than the avoidant intends it to. Early messages, if there are any, often try to re-establish the old dynamic, casual, low-stakes, testing whether the door is truly closed or whether this is simply another version of the temporary distance they have weathered before. These messages are rarely direct. They rarely name what actually happened. They are designed to feel safe enough to send while still preserving the option of retreat if the response is not welcoming. When those messages receive nothing, or receive only the calm, unbothered response of someone who has genuinely moved past needing their approval, the tone shifts. The messages that follow, if they come at all, start to lose their careful composure. They become longer. They become more specific. They start referencing details they would never have bothered to mention before, evidence that they are searching for any thread that might reopen a conversation you have already closed. This shift is the panic becoming visible. It is the sound of someone realizing in real time that the strategies which always worked in the past, the strategic distance, the calculated reappearance, the practiced nonchalance, are simply not landing anymore because you are no longer the person waiting on the other end to receive them. What you are witnessing, if you are witnessing this, is not affection finally emerging. It is panic dressed up as affection, because panic rarely announces itself honestly, especially from someone who has spent a lifetime avoiding honest announcements of any kind. What silence does to someone who weaponized it. There is a particular kind of reckoning reserved for people who spent years using silence and distance as tools against others, once they finally experience real silence directed back at them. The avoidant used quiet as a form of control for so long that they likely never considered what it would feel like from the other side, never imagined a version of events where they became the one waiting for a response that does not come. Now they are living inside that exact experience, and it is unbearable to them in a way it never was to inflict. Every hour without a reply from you stretches longer than it has any right to. Every read receipt without a response, every unanswered message, every day that passes without the contact they have grown so unaccustomed to living without, registers as evidence of something they cannot control, something they cannot manage through the usual tools of withdrawal and reappearance. This is not cruelty on your part. You are not required to respond simply because they are now uncomfortable with an experience they themselves created and normalized for years, long before you ever had the chance to respond in kind. What is happening is simply the natural consequence of someone finally encountering the tool they used against another person, wielded honestly and without malice, by someone who no longer has any obligation to make their discomfort easier to bear. The new relationship that isn't working. If the avoidant has already moved toward someone new, which some do quickly, driven by an urgent need to prove to themselves that they have not lost anything important, that new connection is rarely delivering what they hoped it would. Speed in these situations is almost never a sign of readiness. It is far more often a sign of panic, an attempt to install a replacement quickly enough that the absence never has time to be felt fully. But replacements built on panic rarely hold up under their own weight. The avoidant finds themselves comparing almost immediately the new person against you, not in some abstract sense but in specific, concrete ways. The specific patience you extended, the specific way you understood their moods without demanding explanation, the specific effort you made that this new person, still early in getting to know them, has not yet had the chance to offer or perhaps never double you. This comparison creates a quiet but persistent dissatisfaction that the avoidant cannot quite explain to themselves, let alone to the new person receiving the comparison without knowing it is happening. They tell themselves this new connection is different, is exciting, is exactly what they needed. But underneath that story is the growing, uncomfortable awareness that they did not solve anything by moving quickly. They simply postponed the reckoning, and the postponement is starting to feel very much like the mistake it actually is. The nights the panic gets loudest. There is a specific hour, familiar to anyone who has lived through genuine panic, when the noise of the day fades and there is nothing left to distract from what is actually happening internally. For the avoidant, this hour has become unbearable in a way it never was before, because it is the hour when the finality of your decision becomes impossible to avoid feeling directly. During the day, there are tasks, distractions, other people to perform composure for. At night, none of that is available. The avoidant lies awake replaying the exact tone of your last message, the exact moment they realized you were not going to respond the way you always had before, the exact instant it became clear that this time, waiting would not work because there was nothing left to wait for. This is when the panic becomes physical, the racing thoughts, the tight chest, the restless turning that refuses to resolve into sleep. This is when the full weight of what happened finally lands, without the daytime buffer of distraction to soften it. And this is happening entirely without your involvement, entirely as a consequence of a decision you made calmly, clearly, and for reasons that had nothing to do with punishing them and everything to do with finally protecting yourself. Why they cannot simply apologize their way back. Somewhere in the middle of this panic, many avoidants attempt the thing they have avoided their entire relationship, a direct, unguarded apology. And it is worth understanding why, even when this apology arrives, it rarely accomplishes what they hope it will accomplish. An apology delivered from panic is not the same as an apology delivered from genuine understanding. Panic-driven apologies are focused entirely on relief from the discomfort of the silence, relief from the fear of permanent loss, relief from having to sit inside a consequence they cannot control. They are rarely focused on you, on what you actually experienced, on the specific ways you were hurt by years of distance and dismissiveness. They are focused on making the panic stop, and you are simply the person who has the power to make that happen. This is why apologies that arrive during the height of panic so often ring hollow, even when the words themselves sound right. You can sense correctly that the urgency behind them is about their own discomfort rather than genuine remorse for yours. And you are under no obligation to reward urgency with access, no matter how convincingly it is dressed up as reflection. The difference between fear and growth. It matters enormously to distinguish between what the avoidant is experiencing right now and what actual growth would require, because panic alone changes nothing. Panic is simply the nervous system's response to a loss of control. It does not by itself produce insight, and it certainly does not produce the sustained, unglamorous work required to become someone capable of showing up differently than they did with you. Real growth would require the avoidant to sit inside this panic long enough to actually understand it, rather than reaching immediately for whatever makes it stop. A new relationship, a dramatic apology, a promise of change delivered before any change has actually occurred. It would require them to examine, honestly and specifically, exactly what pattern led here, rather than settling for a vague story about bad timing or unfortunate circumstances. Most people facing this kind of panic do not do that work. They find the fastest available relief and mistake that relief for resolution. If the avoidant eventually returns with claims of having changed, it is worth remembering that panic subsiding is not the same as a pattern being resolved, and you are allowed to require far more evidence than a single moment of desperate clarity before you consider trusting it. What you are allowed to feel about their panic. You are also allowed to feel a quiet satisfaction, private and yours, in knowing that the decision you made was not just right for you, but was also the thing that finally exposed a pattern you spent so long being told was your own oversensitivity. You are allowed to feel validated, without that validation requiring you to feel cruel for having it. You are also allowed to feel nothing at all, if that is genuinely where you are. Not every ending requires you to track the emotional aftermath on the other side in order to know you did the right thing. Sometimes the clearest sign of healing is simply not needing to know how they are doing, because their internal state stopped being your responsibility the moment you decided to protect your own. What you are not required to feel is guilt. Their panic is not evidence that you were too hasty, too harsh, or too quick to leave. It is evidence that the relationship was, in fact, unsustainable, and that the imbalance you were living inside was real, not imagined, not exaggerated, not the product of you asking for too much from someone who was never going to give it. The version of events they are not ready to accept. Somewhere in the avoidance panic is a version of events they are actively resisting, because accepting it would require dismantling the entire story they told themselves throughout the relationship. That version is simple. You did not leave because you stopped caring. You left because you cared enough to finally stop accepting less than you deserved. This is a much harder story for the avoidant to sit with than any alternative they might construct. It would be easier for them to believe you left out of impatience, or misunderstanding, or unreasonable expectations, because those explanations do not require them to examine their own behavior. But the panic itself is evidence against those easier stories. People do not panic this intensely over a decision they believe was unfair or unreasonable. They panic because some part of them recognizes, even if they cannot say it out loud yet, that the decision was completely justified, and that recognition is far more threatening to their self-image than any accusation you could have made directly. Why their panic does not obligate you to anything. None of what the avoidant is experiencing right now creates any obligation on your part. Their panic is not a debt you owe a response to. It is not a signal that you should reconsider, soften, or make yourself available to manage a discomfort they created for themselves through years of behavior that led directly to this outcome. You are allowed to let their panic exist entirely without your involvement. You are allowed to let them sit inside the consequence of their own choices without rescuing them from it, the same way you were once left to sit inside consequences of their choices without any rescue offered to you. This is not revenge. It is simply the natural, uninterrupted unfolding of what happens when someone spends years assuming a pattern will hold indefinitely, only to discover, finally, that it does not. The decision you made was never about them. It is worth returning in the middle of all this to what your decision was actually about, because it was never primarily about punishing the avoidant or engineering this exact panic as some kind of strategy. Your decision was about you, about refusing to keep accepting almost, about refusing to keep interpreting distance as depth, about finally trusting the pattern you had been watching for years instead of the potential you kept hoping would eventually arrive. The panic on their side is simply a byproduct, not the point. You did not leave to make them suffer. You left because staying required a version of yourself that was smaller, more patient with mistreatment, more willing to accept crumbs than you were built to tolerate indefinitely. Whatever is happening to them now is simply what happens when a pattern collides with a person who finally stops enabling it, and that collision was always going to be uncomfortable for the person whose entire strategy depended on the enabling continuing. What comes next for you? Regardless of how the avoidance panic resolves, whether it produces genuine change, a hollow apology, a rushed new relationship, or years of quiet regret that never fully surfaces into anything actionable, your task now has nothing to do with their outcome. Your task is simply to keep living inside the decision you already made, with the same clarity that allowed you to make it in the first place. This means resisting the pull to check on them, to interpret their panic as an invitation, to mistake their discomfort for evidence that you should reconsider. It means allowing their reaction to exist entirely separately from your healing, refusing to let their unraveling become the measure of whether your decision was correct. Your decision was correct the moment you made it, based on what you had lived through and what you were no longer willing to accept, and nothing that happens on their end afterward changes that foundation. The panic confirms what you already knew. Strip everything else away, and what remains is simple. The avoidance panic confirms that the relationship mattered to them far more than their behavior throughout it ever suggested. It confirms that the distance was never a sign of low investment in some neutral sense, but a defense mechanism protecting something they were too afraid to risk directly. It confirms, finally and unmistakably, that what you offered was valuable enough that its absence is now producing exactly the kind of reckoning you might have hoped for while you were still inside the relationship and receiving none of it. But this confirmation arrives too late to change the outcome, and that timing is not your failure. It is simply the cost of a pattern that could only be broken through consequence, not through patience, not through more understanding, not through more time given to someone who had already been given more time than the relationship could reasonably sustain. The sudden interest in your life. One of the more predictable symptoms of this panic is a sudden, almost compulsive interest in a life they showed little curiosity about while it was happening directly in front of them. The avoidant who rarely asked how your day went, who rarely remembered the details of things you cared about, who often seemed distracted or elsewhere even when physically present, now finds themselves checking for updates, watching for signs of how you are doing, paying closer attention to your life from a distance than they ever managed to pay while sharing it with you directly. This is not affection finally arriving on schedule. It is panic manifesting as surveillance, an attempt to manage uncertainty by gathering information, because information feels like a form of control even when it changes nothing about the actual situation. Watching from a distance does not require vulnerability. It does not require risk. It allows the avoidant to feel connected to you without ever having to demonstrate the presence that connection actually requires, which is precisely the pattern that led to this outcome in the first place. If you notice this kind of distant attention, a like on something you posted after months of silence, a mutual friend mentioning that they asked about you, a sense that they know more about your current life than they should, given the silence between you, recognize it for what it is. It is not evidence of readiness. It is evidence of panic finding the least vulnerable possible outlet, one that costs the avoidant nothing and demands nothing of you in return, exactly the kind of low-risk involvement that has always been their specialty. The comparison they cannot escape. Just as you might compare your life now to what it once was, the avoidant is running a comparison of their own, though theirs is considerably less comfortable. Every new interaction they have, every new person they meet, every attempt to recreate the ease you offered without effort, becomes an unintentional measurement against a standard they did not fully appreciate until it disappeared. This comparison is not something the avoidant chooses to run. It happens involuntarily, triggered by small, ordinary moments, a conversation that falls flat where yours never would have, a silence that feels awkward where your silences felt comfortable, an absence of the specific patience you extended without complaint for years. Each of these moments becomes its own small confirmation that what they lost was not easily replaceable, and each confirmation adds another layer to the panic they are already struggling to manage. What makes this comparison particularly unbearable is that it cannot be resolved through more effort in the new situation, because the comparison is not really about the new person's shortcomings. It is about the specific, irreplaceable quality of what existed between you, built over time, through patience you may not choose to extend to anyone else again. The avoidant is discovering, in real time, that ease like that does not simply appear on command with someone new, and the discovery is arriving precisely when they have no way to reverse the decision that cost them access to it. The story they tell other people. Watch, if you have any visibility into it, how the story the avoidant tells other people about what happened begins to shift over time. In the immediate aftermath, the story is often composed and self-protective, a narrative where the ending was mutual, or where they were simply not ready, or where circumstances beyond anyone's control simply got in the way. This version of the story allows them to maintain the image they have spent years cultivating, the image of someone who is fine, who is unbothered, who walks away from things cleanly. But stories like this are difficult to maintain under the pressure of genuine panic, and eventually, in unguarded moments, a different version starts to slip out. This version is less composed, more honest, occasionally even self-incriminating in ways the earlier version carefully avoided. It might include an admission that they pulled away too often, that they did not appreciate what they had, that they are not entirely sure they made the right call in letting things end the way they did. This shift matters not because you need to hear it directly, but because it confirms something important. The composed version was always a performance, constructed to protect an image rather than to reflect the truth. The panic is what happens when that performance becomes too exhausting to maintain, when the truth underneath finally becomes louder than the story built to obscure it. The physical toll of losing control. Panic of this magnitude rarely stays confined to the mind, and the avoidant is likely discovering this the same way anyone does when a nervous system that has spent years managing threat through distance suddenly finds distance is no longer an available tool. Sleep becomes unreliable. Concentration becomes difficult to sustain. Small tasks that used to feel manageable now require an amount of effort that feels disproportionate to their actual size. This is what a nervous system does when it loses its primary coping mechanism without having developed a replacement. For years, the avoidant managed discomfort by creating distance, and distance always worked, at least well enough to keep the discomfort at bay. Now facing a discomfort that distance cannot solve because the distance itself is the source of the discomfort, their body is left without its usual strategy, and the resulting dysregulation shows up physically, in restlessness, in appetite changes, in an exhaustion that has no other explanation. None of this is something you are responsible for soothing. It is simply what happens to someone who spent years avoiding the direct experience of vulnerability, finally encountering it without the option to retreat from it. Their body is doing the work their mind avoided doing for years, and the work is uncomfortable precisely because it was deferred for so long. Why their regret does not change the math. Even if the avoidant reaches a place of full, unguarded regret, recognizing exactly what they did, exactly why they did it, exactly what it cost you, this regret does not change the fundamental math of the situation. Regret arriving after the fact is not the same as presence offered while it still mattered. You needed honesty and consistency while you were still inside the relationship, not confirmation of your worth delivered months later, once the relationship had already ended and the damage had already been fully absorbed by you alone. This is an important distinction to hold on to, especially if the avoidance regret ever becomes visible to you directly. Regret can be completely genuine and still arrive too late to matter in any practical sense. You are allowed to receive that regret, if you ever do, without treating it as an argument for reconsidering anything. It is simply confirmation, delivered on their timeline rather than yours, of something you already knew to be true while you were the one carrying the weight of not being met. The question of whether they will change. People often wonder, understandably, whether this kind of panic represents a turning point, whether the avoidant, having finally experienced the cost of their pattern directly, will use this experience to become someone capable of different behavior in the future. The honest answer is that it depends entirely on choices that have not yet been made, choices that require sustained effort long after the initial panic fades. Some avoidants do use experiences like this as the catalyst for real change, engaging in the slow, unglamorous work of understanding where the pattern came from and building new capacities for tolerance of closeness that they never had before. Many others do not. They ride out the panic until it becomes bearable again, find a way to numb the discomfort through distraction or a new relationship entered too quickly, and eventually settle back into the same pattern with someone new, having learned the lesson intellectually without ever internalizing it enough to behave differently. You have no way of knowing in the moment which path the avoidant in your life will take, and more importantly, it is not your responsibility to find out. Whether they change is a question that belongs entirely to their future, lived apart from you, on a timeline that no longer includes you at all, and your healing does not need to wait for an answer to it. What this panic teaches you about your own worth. Perhaps the most valuable thing to take from witnessing this panic, if you witness any of it at all, is not vindication over the avoidance discomfort, but confirmation of something about yourself that the relationship made difficult to trust. For a long time, you may have wondered whether you were asking for too much, whether your need for presence and honesty was somehow unreasonable, whether the distance you experienced was simply the normal texture of any long relationship rather than a specific failure of someone unwilling to meet you. The panic answers that question definitively. People do not panic this intensely over the loss of something unimportant, something replaceable, something that was never actually valuable to begin with. The intensity of their unraveling is, in its own way, a confirmation that what you offered was significant, that your presence mattered more than their behavior throughout the relationship ever demonstrated, and that your decision to leave was not an overreaction but a long overdue correction. You do not need their panic to know this. You likely already knew it somewhere underneath the doubt that years of inconsistency planted in you, but if their panic does anything useful at all, let it be this: a final, undeniable piece of evidence that you were never the problem, and that leaving was never anything other than exactly the right decision, made exactly when it needed to be made. The people who warned you and the people who didn't. Somewhere in the aftermath of this decision, you may find yourself thinking back on the people who tried to warn you, gently or not so gently, about the pattern you were living inside long before you were ready to see it clearly yourself. Perhaps a friend once said something you brushed aside, or a therapist named a dynamic you weren't yet prepared to confront directly, or you noticed something in your own gut that you talked yourself out of trusting, because trusting it would have meant facing an ending before you felt ready to face it. There is no need to punish yourself for the time it took to arrive at this decision. Recognizing a pattern of avoidance from the inside of a relationship is genuinely difficult, especially when the person enacting that pattern is skilled, whether consciously or not, at making distance feel like depth and inconsistency feel like complexity. You were not slow. You were simply inside something that was specifically designed, by years of conditioning on their part, to be difficult to see clearly from where you were standing. What matters now is not how long it took you to get here, but the fact that you did get here, clearly and finally, in a way that produced exactly the kind of reckoning that patience alone was never going to produce. The people who warned you were not wrong, but neither were you, for needing your own timeline to reach the same conclusion they saw more quickly from the outside. Why their panic will not look like what you imagine. It is worth preparing yourself for the possibility that the avoidance panic, if you ever witness any part of it directly, will not look like the dramatic reckoning you might imagine. Real panic in someone who has spent a lifetime avoiding direct emotional expression rarely announces itself cleanly. It does not always look like tears or explicit admission. Sometimes it looks like erratic behavior that makes little outward sense, a sudden burst of activity, a new hobby taken up with unusual intensity, a new relationship pursued with a speed that has nothing to do with genuine readiness and everything to do with outrunning discomfort. Sometimes the panic is nearly invisible from the outside entirely, expressed only through subtle shifts that only someone who knew them well would notice. A change in posture in photographs, a tone in messages to mutual friends that reads as slightly too forced, an unusual quietness in situations where they were once reliably talkative. The avoidance entire strategy has always been concealment, and panic does not automatically undo a lifetime of practiced concealment. It simply adds pressure to a system already straining to maintain its usual performance. This means you may never see clean, satisfying evidence of what you already know to be true. You may have to trust the logic of the situation rather than any direct confirmation of it. that a person who spent years relying on the assumption of your patience is now living without it, and that this loss, whether or not it is ever visible to you, is producing exactly the kind of internal reckoning that consistency and patience never could. The freedom of no longer needing to know. There is a particular kind of freedom available to you now that was not available while you were still inside the relationship, watching closely for any sign of change, any indication that things might finally shift in the direction you needed them to shift. That freedom is simply not needing to know anymore, not needing updates, not needing confirmation. Not needing to track the exact shape of their unraveling in order to feel confident that your decision was correct. This freedom can feel unfamiliar at first, especially if you spent years accustomed to monitoring their moods, anticipating their withdrawals, managing your own behavior around the unpredictable terrain of their availability. Letting go of that vigilance is its own form of healing. Separate entirely from anything happening on their end. You do not need their panic confirmed to trust your own clarity. You do not need proof of their suffering to know that staying would have cost you more than leaving ever could. Give yourself permission to simply stop watching, if watching is something you have been doing. The decision you made does not require ongoing surveillance to remain correct. It was correct the day you made it, and it remains correct regardless of what happens next, whether that next chapter for them involves panic, denial, growth, or some combination of all three that you will likely never fully see. Closing. You made the right decision, and nothing happening on the other side of that decision, now or in whatever comes after this, will ever change its correctness. The avoidant is panicking now because the assumption they built their entire approach to you around has finally, permanently collapsed, and there is nothing you owe them in response to that collapse. Their discomfort is not your responsibility to soothe. Their growth, if it comes, is not something you need to wait around to witness. Their apology, if it arrives, does not require your acceptance simply because it exists. What you get to do now is keep walking forward, exactly as clearly as you walked away, trusting that the decision which produced this much panic on their end was, without question, the decision you needed to make for yourself. The path ahead of you does not require their resolution to be complete. It only requires you, continuing forward, finally free of a pattern that took years to recognize, and only a single clear decision to finally leave behind for good. Let their panic exist entirely without you, unwitnessed and unmanaged, exactly as your years of quiet patience once existed largely unacknowledged and unreciprocated by them. You do not owe the ending a tidy resolution, and you certainly do not owe it your continued attention or concern. The right decision does not need a witnessed aftermath to remain right. It simply needs you, moving forward steadily and without looking back into a life built around people, finally capable of meeting you the way you were always willing to be met.